Okay, good morning. My name's Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana on a Saturday morning. And today's class, um, we didn't used to do much on apples and pears a long time ago, but now it's turned out to be, especially apples, our most reliable fruit tree, which is interesting. So, apples and pears both come from Asia originally, Western Asia. The European pears were kind of bred more toward Turkey and even into Italy. And then the Chinese and Asian pears were bred mostly in the eastern, but they all originated kind of in the western or the center of Eurasia. And the apples come from the same place. So they're all from that area of the world. They were all domesticated quite a while ago. So people have been improving the apple quality and pear quality for quite a long time. So they're closely related and they suffer from similar problems. Um, let's go over some planting rules first. So the nice thing about apples and pears is that they are really tolerant of wet conditions. The other problem, though, is they like it wet. So they like a lot of water around the roots, especially apples. I mean, I've got a book written by an Oregon apple farmer, and he doesn't know how we can grow apples in California. He says they want 5 foot of wet soil below the trees. So, and in Oregon they rain enough, or normally they rain enough. They're recovering from drought right now. They've had quite a few Pacific storms this year, so they're going to have enough water this year, but they don't know how we can grow apples when our soils, we only keep our soil wet about 18 inches at most. So now this year, in the last week, we've probably got the ground is wet at least a foot deep now, if not more than that. So we're looking good this year. So lots of water. Now the other thing that's interesting about apples and pears, pear trees, this is a pear right here, is the most tolerant of low oxygen levels of any tree we know of, any plant we know of. I don't know, there's probably a few grasses that are even more superior, but they said pear roots can take water down to an oxygen content of about 2 parts per million. Now, the water districts, when they send water through the pipes to your home, they aerate that water. They make sure there's 5 to 7 parts per million, because if the oxygen level in the water gets too low when you water your plants with it, they suffocate. They actually suffocate. There's got to be oxygen in the water. Rainwater has plenty of oxygen in it. Tap water usually has a lot, unless if it's recycled from a sewage treatment plant, it's got no oxygen. So before they send that water through the system, they've got to aerate it, spray it up in the air, get it oxygenated before they can send it through the pipes. I mean, by law, it's got to be 5 to 7 parts per million. Sometimes you turn on the faucet, it looks milky. That's aerated water. If you look at it closely, you see the bubbles going through the water and rising to the surface. So they aerated that water so that it won't kill your plants. But pears can go really low on the oxygen. So, and so they can grow in just about any soil. Now, we recommend, if you're putting in pots, to use our top pot potting soil, because there's no compost. The problem we have with compost, if you use it as soil, and most potting soils are compost, is that the compost is still decomposing at a slow rate, and it still sucks all the oxygen out as it decomposes. Our soil basically doesn't do that, and plus it's got a lot of sand, rocks, and things to make it breathe on top of that. But pears, if you put them in conventional compost potting soils, will make it. They can handle the low oxygen levels you find in compost. Apples, pretty similar. So, so they're not as picky. If you put a lot of compost around the roots, you probably won't kill it. I mean, it's better if you don't. In nature, compost is on the surface of the soil. But if you do, that's one of the reasons you see a lot of ornamental pear trees on streets, because they survive what the nurseries have grown them in, and they survive what they put in the holes with them. So they're one of those trees that are survivors. So planting wise, not too critical. I mean, all the plants we sell are grafted. And generally we want the graft union to be at or above soil level. So on this particular tree, this is the rootstock. It's grafted right here, and generally the soil level you choose will be anywhere above the roots and below the graft. I mean, I've planted apple trees 4 inches deep. They still make it because the roots can, again, they can breathe through a lot of dirt. Generally, we like to keep the roots close to the surface where they can breathe better. The more oxygen the roots can breathe, the roots of a plant consume oxygen. The leaves of the same plant create oxygen, but they don't have a way to get it down through the trunk. It's got to go through the ground. So roots on plants generally stay within a foot of the surface of the soil, or even closer than that. And the other thing is, one little trick, sometimes right here, because if you face this toward the sun hits this pretty flush. You sometimes get a sunburn there. So if you want to make sure it doesn't, some of these grafts aren't quite as dog-legged as this is, or go off to the side as much. Sometimes they're a little straighter and you don't have to worry about it. But they usually say to face the graft toward the sun, so that the sun can't hit this side of the tree. It can only hit this side, and there's nothing to hit. So they are subject to sunburning a bit. Now normally when it gets hot in the summer, they're full of leaves, the foliage protects the trunk. But we've had some really hot winters in the last 10 years, so you do have to watch that when they're bare. Now the other thing is, apples tend not to go bare if we have mild winter. So this year, pretty mild winter, no frost yet, no sign of frost coming. Apple trees will often keep their leaves all the way through winter. So we tell people, well, before they bloom, say a month before they're supposed to bloom, knock all the leaves off. Now with most apples and pears, they don't bloom until spring. In fact, apples, we say May, although there are 2 apples and a few pears that bloom early. So this is one of the early bloomers here, blooms in February. There's 3 apples we know of that bloom in February. In Orange County, all the rest bloom in May and June over a long period of time. So, say on most apples, you would pull all the leaves off around end of March, beginning of April. Just take your finger down the stems and zip them all off. We like to keep them on during the winter if they're still healthy, because they still collect energy for your fruit production, but they bloom better if there's no leaves. They do require bees to pollinate the flowers, so you can't grow them in your house or in a greenhouse without leaving the doors open. Most apples we've seen will make fruit without cross-pollination, and the pears also. They're better with it, but every apple I know of that we sell has made fruit without being pollinated, even the ones that say they need it. Now what we've noticed is if they aren't pollinated by a different variety, there's fewer seeds in the fruit. So in other words, apples you see, usually it's 5 seeds or 6 seeds? I think it's 5 seeds. If they're not cross-pollinated, a lot of times we only see 1. And when that happens, your apple gets a bit lopsided. So you have a better crop if you have pollinators around that bloom at the same time. But don't worry if you don't. We've always seen them make fruit all by themselves. So again, a little better quality, maybe 10%, 15% more weight of fruit, because the fruits are bigger and rounder if you have a cross-pollinator. So commercially, they always cross-pollinate. They put two varieties in. And it's interesting, they usually originally they said, well, you have one row of Fuji's, one row of Galas, one row of Fuji's, one row of Galas. And then the farmers noticed when they were watching the bees that they just went straight down the row. They wouldn't cross 8 foot to the next row. So now they intersperse some Fuji Gala, Fuji Gala, to get them to get that cross-pollination better. So, okay, so pretty much same with pears. I had a pear tree, 2 pear trees at my last house to cross-pollinate with each other. One died because it wasn't suited for a climate and didn't bloom anyway. And the other one sulked for like 5 years. It'd bloom and not make fruit. I thought, boy, I'm screwed. But after about 7 years, it started making hundreds of pears without a pollinator. So I just decided to make fruit. So we don't think they need pollinators, but they all recommend it, especially commercially. So, okay, so the one problem that both pears and apples have, so now if you were in Oregon, or if it rains all the way till summer, which it did last year, it just pretty much rained all spring, they can get a leaf disease called apple scab. It's like if you've grown roses, it looks just like black spot on roses, and the same chemicals cure it. Generally, we don't worry about it because it is rare. I mean, we've seen it 2 years, and usually on this anna because it leaves out real early, so the leaves are hit by the rain. If the rain is around April or May, the leaves get hit by the rain pretty good. And we've seen it on them, but we just pick those leaves off that get the gray spots on them, and that does it. It can get real bad where it affects the fruit also, so you don't want it around. But around here, it's a minor problem. I mean, we saw it 95. It was the first time we ever saw apple scab because it was an El Nino rain till June. And last year we saw a little bit, and it was always on anna. The other apples leaf out later, so they weren't affected. Pears usually leaf out late too, so we haven't really seen it on them. Now, fire blight is the main problem for both apples and pears. And fire blight is a bacterial infection brought to the tree by bees when they visit the flowers. So it is kind of a pain. You can stop fire blight by shielding the whole plant from bees, but then you won't get any fruit unless you hand pollinate. So there's different ways you can handle it. The simple way is to watch the blooms. If you're out there once a week looking at your flower petals, they open pink, mature to white, and then should drop off kind of tan colored. If the petals turn gray or black on you, they're infected. So you just pick off that flower real fast. If you don't, it's like gangrene going down the stems, and you got to cut off the stem. And on a young tree, fire blight can kill it. On older trees, it'll usually go down one branch to the main trunk and stop. But on young trees, it can kill the tree. So you watch your blooms to stop that. Now, there is a pesticide we sell, or you can call it a fungicide. So there's a product called Garden Foss. And it's mono and di potassium salts of phosphorus acid. In some states, the United States, this is labeled as a fertilizer because that's essentially what it is, potassium and phosphorus. And apparently if you raise the phosphorus level in the sap of a plant high enough, that helps it fight off diseases really well. So it's kind of artificially getting the phosphorus content of the plant high enough, and it fights off the diseases quite well. I mean, we were sent letters by the Ag Department or the University of California when this product first came out because they said they were saving avocado trees from almost total death from root rot by just applying this. But We find it most useful on apples and pears. There's several instructions on here. You can dilute it by half. Just spray the trunks before they bloom, or you can really dilute it and spray the foliage when they do bloom. And they both work. It works both ways that way. So it stops most of the fire blight. If you're worried about it, you can also get and you just observe your flowers and pick off the ones that get it. There's one major pest we get on both apples and pears, insect-wise, and that's codling moth. So this is the moth that flies around laying eggs on the fruit as they develop, and they burrow into the fruit, and you got your apple and your worm in your apple or worm in your pear. They mainly attack apples that ripen in the summer, August, September. They don't ripen the apples that ripen in June or July, and they don't attack the apples that ripen late fall. And fortunately, most of the apples we grow ripen early or late, not in midsummer. The pears ripen in summer, so you do have to watch the pears. The simple way to control this bug is to make sure you don't have two fruit touching each other. So here with these blooms, this is a cluster of 5 flowers there and more coming out there. If you let these develop, they're going to all be touching each other. In general, you want your fruit to hang singly. So when we grow apples and pears, you let the fruit form. You wait till a lot of it self-aborts anyway. You wait till about the size of a golf ball, or maybe a little smaller than the golf ball, large marble-sized fruit. So it's going to make the tree is going to keep it, and then you clip off all but one, and make sure there's no two clusters close together so they don't touch each other, because the moth hides the eggs right where two fruit touch. The fruit's touching a branch, they'll hide it there too, because there's a lot of predators walking around your trees, lacewing larvae, ladybug larvae, and there's a lot of parasitic wasps flying around looking for eggs. So they have to hide the eggs either where the fruit touches a leaf, or it touches the trunk, or where two fruit touches each other. We notice when two fruit touch each other, there's a hole right where they touch going to both fruits. That's where they hide the eggs. In fact, sometimes there's several holes because they put more than one egg there. So make sure they don't touch, and that'll stop most of it. The other way, I forgot to bring it up. So back in the 80s, University of California did some testing. It said, well, the other way you stop the worms is you just cover each fruit with a little paper bag. Number 2 paper bag from, like Smart and Final or something. And they said to punch a hole in the bottom of the bag, big enough to slip it over the apple that's about the size of a marble, and roll up the other end, and nothing will ever touch that apple. Birds won't see it. The bugs won't know what to do with the bag. There are silk bags you can get too from hobby stores with little pull strings on them. What is it called? Garbons? Something bag. You put gift items in, you just cinch it tight, and you can do it that way too. So, but it's a bit of work. But just thinning the fruit out has worked for us quite well. There's a few apples that still get worms even if you thin out the fruit, because the apples are so big, and apparently the skin is easy to hide in. I don't know. But Mutsu apple, we would get attacked even if we thinned them out, but most other apples, there's no attack if there's no hiding places. At least I guess the beneficials are cleaning them off really well for us. So those are the major pests that apples get. Now, both apples and pears last year got mildew on the foliage. really good. I mean, we just didn't have any sunlight till August. So we went through and sprayed with our oil spray. You can use some organic oils. The mineral oil is a lot cheaper. They're both considered organic because they're evaporating gone. If you mix this horticultural oil with so what we usually do, and this mineral oil is, I think, it's 98% oil, so it's just about pure. So we do, in 1 gallon of water, we do 4 tablespoons of this and 1 tablespoon of baking soda in 1 gallon of water. And that really cleaned up the mildew for us last summer. I mean, our regular fungicides, chemical fungicides, weren't working. But this is a method we started doing back in the 80s, and it worked on our grapes, our apples, pears, plum. Everything had mildew last year. Grapes, roses, cleaned it up really nicely. And it's considered an organic way to do it. Mildew usually starts out around May, June, July. Those are the main mildew months. Oh, I should mention the codling moth. Commercially, if you're organic, you would use something with spinosad in it. This lasts 2 weeks on the fruit. You're not supposed to use it within, I think, 7 days of harvest. But spinosad is found in rum, so it's not that. They say you can spray basil and eat it the next day, and lettuce eat the next day. For some reason, apples, they have you wait 5 or 7 days. You'd think apples would have less problem. They say tomatoes, yeah, you can eat the next day. It's kind of weird. Apples, you're supposed to wait. Okay, let me think if there's any other bugs or diseases. Okay, training the trees. We train apples and pears similarly. Commercially, an awful lot of them espalier their plants now. So this is an espaliered apple, and this is an interesting one because this is not normal espaliering. So normally you can take an apple tree that looks like this and take a couple branches here and grow them sideways, cut off all these. Take another set a few foot higher, train them sideways, and then cut your trunk where you need the next set to grow, and then they'll branch out about 4 or 5 branches, and you take 2 sideways, go 1 straight up, keep doing that. Have them spaced about 1 to 1.5 feet apart, and go as high as you want. The ones that are done from a nursery in Oregon that is spaced 1 foot apart, and it's like 3 foot high. So to us, this is kind of low for putting in the ground. In a container, it works. I mean, put a container this high, it's at the perfect height. But for the ground, it's kind of low. It's like you might as well do it yourself. And these cost about 1/3 more than this. Double the cost to have it espaliered for you, whereas it's simple for you to do it in the year. So apples are real flexible when they're young. Branches are real flexible. The one thing to know about if you are espaliering apples, the branches don't grow if they're like this. They have to be pointed up at the end. If they're pointed up at the end, they continue growing, not straight up, but slightly up, they'll continue to elongate. And as they elongate, then you lay them down as they go. But if you put them totally horizontal, then all these buds open up and start trying to go straight up, and this one stops. So keep the branch tips going upward slightly. That's why you see them all curved up, and lay them down as they grow. And then all these will sprout out, and you clip them about 3 or 4 inches off the main stem here. Just keep clipping them all summer. After a few years of that, they stop trying to grow, and during fall, the end of that branch makes flower buds. So then you'll get fruit all along the branches. So both apples and pears can be espaliered. Otherwise, one of the current methods of doing them is a spindle-shaped plant with, again, a tier of branches every foot. Something like this. Now, some of our trees, like this one, already have 1 or 2 tiers on them. This in reality, just 1 tier. You can probably use these 4 branches. You go 4 directions here, and then these are too close, so you might have to cut it here to make a 2nd tier. Apples and pears are both really fast growers. Usually in 1 year they'll grow 6 foot. So, you can, if you wanted to make tiers on them, you can probably do that within 1 year, get up to about 5 foot of tiers within 1 year. Just cut them, let them branch and grow, choose one for the middle, make all the other ones go horizontally, and then make another tier as they continue growing that year. In the nursery, we don't have enough room, so we let them grow naturally. Like this is a pear we let grow naturally. You can see all the branches wanted to be the central leader. And when you do that, they don't fruit as well. So if the branch is going to the side, you get better fruiting spurs all along that branch. When it's kind of like this, the tips of each branch have all the fruiting spurs, and when they're at the tips and you have fruit forming on the tips, they get sunburned easier. Not all of them sunburn, but you usually get 1 or 2 that sunburn real bad, so you're kind of wasting it. So it's better to, if you can, if the branch is pliable enough, just weight it down or tie it down to a stake on the ground, and then it'll suddenly act like and develop fruit all along here better. We've just let this grow straight up because in the nursery we don't have room to make this thing spread out. Now, if the branch is too stiff to bend it down, you do what is called a Dutch cut on the branch, which is you cut it to the bud on the bottom side of this branch to make the branch go this way instead of other directions. So if this branch weren't pliable, I'd cut it to this bud right here, and then new growth comes out this way, and then you try to keep that flat. This branch is still pliable enough I can lay it down. In fact, all these branches seem to be still fairly pliable. So you can take this pear tree and open it up and get it to fruit better. I mean, there's no rules here. If you already have 2 trunks, don't cut one off, just use it. But if you don't have 2 trunks, don't waste the plant's energy in making 2. But if it already has 2, you can use it. So generally we want the bottom branches to be longer than the top so they get the sunlight coming in. And generally what they've said is 5 or 6 foot wide is about as wide as you want. About 8 foot, 10 foot tall is about as tall as you want it to be. In the old days, we grew in apples and pears a different form, which was the open vase. But they found the open vase is too big and the sunlight doesn't get all the way through there. So most of the tree is too shaded for production, whereas the spindle shape is highly productive per square foot. You need more trees in your orchard because they're smaller trees, but you get pretty much every square foot is producing fruit. So you can say, well, let's plant an apple tree every 7 or 8 foot in your yard. And that way you can spread out your production too. So the nice thing about apples is we have about the longest harvest period among the different cultivars. So the earliest apples ripen here in June. The latest apples will hang fruit until next year, say February or even March. The fruit will just hang on the trees. Any questions about care or pruning? Lots of water. So the main thing is keep the soil wet. If you don't know how to check moisture in the ground, farmers, before they had computers, would walk around with a piece of rebar like this and see how far they can push it in. If the ground is wet, this will go in. If it's dry, it won't. And you want to be able to push this in between a foot and a foot and a half by hand. If an apple tree doesn't have that much moisture, it looks terrible. I mean, I first started growing apples, my last house, 93, and around 97, they were looking really, all brown tip leaves. I'm going, what's wrong with my apple trees? In 98, we had that 35 inches of rain, and they looked wonderful. I go, okay. They needed more water. They were getting bigger, and my neighbor's trees were getting bigger and encroaching, so they weren't getting as much water as they were originally. I just needed to keep that ground looking wet. But in my last house, we had pure clay, and I remember after that year, 98, I could push this thing into the handle in clay. I mean, it was just wild. Push it all the way down. Now, if you hit a root, you'll know that you hit a root. You just back it up and push it somewhere else. But that's what farmers, I don't know, farmers may still do this. Yes.
How invasive and the roots of an apple tree generally grow?
Well, the apples we sell are all on semi-dwarf rootstocks, and we just don't, most tree roots will go down about a foot and a half, and supposedly they go sideways three times wider at least than the tree is tall. But generally they'll go where you water. But apples aren't known for lifting things, although any plant might after a couple generations. I mean, apples are the longest lived orchard tree. So like on the short end, peaches 13 years is typical now. Apples easily, you find orchards that are well over 100 years old. So that's because they repair their wounds really well. Yeah.
The longest lived apple was 294.
Okay. So we had a comment that some apple trees have been around for close to 300 years. Yeah, that are known. 300 years, yeah. So apples and pears both heal wounds really well. And this is among all plants. So the U.S. Forest Department determined like 50 years ago that apple trees, one reason they live so long is they repair their wounds really, really well. You cut them, they heal right there. Whereas peaches are about as bad as you can get. You cut a peach and you get a wound all the way down the branch to the roots, the size of that cut you just made. That's why they don't live very long, is because you end up with a hollow tree really quickly. So, or all the wood is gone from termites or from fungi or both. Oh, fertilizer-wise, we're always low in nitrogen. So nitrogen in around Orange County in the ground, we're low in nitrogen and potassium. The first number and the last number on the box. Middle number phosphorus, we're not low on that. So something like this is fine. In containers, we usually start them off with Osmocote just because organics work better in the ground than they do in pots, especially initially. This one's 15-9-12 time release. But in the long run, the organics are a bit better for the plant and the soil. So if you want, I mean, right now, the least expensive fertilizer you can probably buy from us is chicken manure. There's no numbers on it, but it works well. And if you're growing in pots, we do recommend our top pot potting soil as a good permanent potting soil. Pure sand works fine. That was the original potting soil that everybody forgot about. But pure sand on pears and apple trees works fine. And in containers, you can cover that with the mulch. Same as in the ground, you cover the soil in the ground with a nice mulch, keep the soil moist all the way to the surface. Apples and pears both take the heat of a container quite well. Pears better than apples do. I mean, they grow pears in the high desert here because the heat doesn't seem to bother them much. Apples, if it gets really, really hot, they look a little cooked, but it doesn't usually hurt them that badly. So. Okay. The other thing is, don't be greedy. You know, this thing potentially can make 100 apples on it. If you let it make 100 apples, it'll all be about that big. So you got to thin them out. Back in the 80s, when Fuji first came on the market, it was so popular, the growers were growing too many on the trees to sell. So the university had to put their foot down on those growers, saying these apples you're sending to the stores have no taste at all. You know, because they grew too many apples on one tree. So they actually did a study where they counted the leaves to see how much fruit the apple should hold, the tree can hold. And he said 1 apple every 27 leaves, you'll get a pretty darn good apple. So Fujis are better, you know, late 80s, early 90s, you know, we noticed that the Fujis had no taste. Because they were growing too many on the tree. So generally, this, you know, you can see this, like this one branch here has 3 flower clusters on one branch. Generally, you only want 1 apple to form in that amount of stem. I mean, I've done 2, but be careful now. Anna is an early apple; it doesn't get worms, so. Okay. So both pears and apples have a minimum chill requirement where if they get the winter they want, they bloom better, fruit better. So most apples and pears have a chill requirement of 500 to 700, even 1,000 hours. So they should never be grown here. But we haven't found any pear apple that won't fruit here. So it's interesting. What happens with apples and pears, by the time it gets warm, they go, well, we got to do something, you know, by May or June. So they start blooming at that time. And fortunately for most apples, the majority of apples that have a higher chill requirement ripen in the fall. So like say Granny Smith is supposed to have 600, 700 hours of chill. In Oregon, it'll bloom in April and the fruit will ripen in October. Here, they'll bloom in June and ripen in November, December. But we're not cold, so they make it. So they will ripen here just fine, even though they don't wake up on time. It's interesting, though, Granny Smith was actually developed in Sydney, Australia, which is the same latitude as Mazatlan, Mexico. And they say if you go to Sydney, Australia, you'll see Granny Smith apples growing alongside pineapples. So it's from the tropics. It's from, you know, not from temperate climate, but it grows anyway. And we saw, so back in the 70s, we never thought of growing Red Delicious or, you know, the apples of that age. We never even thought of growing them. And then in the 80s, one by one, we started growing apples. We had someone from Laguna Niguel brought us apples in the 80s, said, you got to grow these apples. And it was Braeburn from New Zealand. And they're wonderful. We said, okay, we got to try that one. And so every year we tried more apples, and all of them did well. So Dave Wilson, about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, that's our supplier, the nursery that supplies all these trees to us. They're one of the few bare root tree suppliers left in California. So Dave Wilson Nursery, they planted everything in their catalog. They've got maybe 100 apples in their catalog or more in Irvine just to see what was happening. And he said only 2 apples did not make a quality fruit. Unfortunately, one of the 2 was Honeycrisp. So we tried Honeycrisp for 10 years. It fruits, and they'll tell you it fruits in Orange County. But the problem with Honeycrisp is it's got such a high chill requirement, 1,000 hours, that it doesn't even wake up until July, and the fruit ripens in August. So it's got maybe 5 weeks to develop a fruit. So we were getting apples on Honeycrisp about that big. They look like a miniature Honeycrisp. They tasted just fine, but they're that big. Now one year it was 96. No, it was 2007. Coldest winter we've had since last winter was a cold winter. 2007 or I think it was 2008 was a really cool winter. So they actually woke up in May or June instead of July, and the apples got about the size of apricots. So that's the best we've been able to do. So we said, okay, no use growing Honeycrisp. There are a lot of good apples we can grow, but Honeycrisp is one of the favorite apples right now. So again, if you want to order one, we can probably get it for you, but that's what you're faced with. All the other apples we do quite well with. Galas tend to be a little small on us. So on apples anyway, there's 3 apples with real low chill. We carry 2 of them. There's Dorset Golden, and there's Anna. This is from Bahamas. Someone spit out a golden delicious apple in the Bahamas, and they got this Dorset Golden. Anna's from Israel. The third one we don't carry is Einschmier, which is another golden delicious offspring from Israel, and they both bloom. They all bloom in February, so we know they don't need much chill. It might be 200 hours of chill or less, and they bloom then, and the fruit ripens. This one's in June. This one's in July. They will both outproduce any apple we've known because both apple trees need so little chill. Sometimes they flower on and off all year round and make apples any month of the year. So they're nice that way, in that they produce, in my own house, any month of the year I can find at least one Anna apple, although the heavy months were July and November, where it was making big crops. Anna's a big apple. I mean, Anna apples are about that size and shape. So they've got good size. They remind you kind of a Red Delicious, but you don't let them turn red totally. You want to pick an Anna apple when it's about 3/4 red. So the problem with the early apples, well, the problem with Dorset in June is we often have June gloom when it's trying to ripen. And if it's ripening during June gloom, it's pretty tart. It doesn't have much sweetness. Anna in July is great. To us, it's one of the closest we can get to the Honeycrisp quality. Slightly tart, lots of sugar. The problem with both of these is the early apples have no hang time and no shelf life. So if you leave them on until they're totally red, they're already going to mush. If you leave them on your shelf for more than a day, they're also going to mush. Now, we know that we found if you put it in a Ziploc bag, squeeze out the air, one of our employees' mom said, you put a straw in the Ziploc bag and you close it to the straw and you suck out all the air, and then you finish zipping it up and you put it in the fridge, it'll hold for 2 months perfectly ripe without going mushy. Lack of oxygen is what keeps oxygen makes apples ripen. Lack of oxygen, you blow your breath in there, it also helps because the way they store apples commercially is they put them in rooms with a lot of carbon dioxide, which is the opposite of oxygen, so won't let them oxidize further, so they stay crisp. Fuji is the longest storage apple known. It'll store 1.5 years commercial. And some of those apples at the store taste like they've been stored a year and a half. But these have short shelf life. But on the other hand, they'll outproduce any apple tree we've ever seen. I mean, a Fuji apple is the slowest apple to produce. You might get one apple the first year and a couple the second. This thing wants to make 100 the first year. And it'll do it over and over the first year. So now, there's no way that thing can hold that much weight, but the apples are impressive on it. So I do like the Anna quite a bit. So the other apples would be in order of ripening: Gala, August. Gala's from New Zealand. The chill on it's fairly low. It'll bloom more like May, around May or so. Then we have Jonagold, and it ripens late summer, so August into September. Our customers along the very coast love this thing. Inland, not so good. So what we know about apples is the fruit quality is the best if the month before they ripen, there's not a prolonged 90-degree week. So if you're inland and you get either Gala or Jonagolds and it's really hot, well, they said Gala does well in the Central Valley, though, and it's hot there. So Gala can handle the heat, Jonagold not so well, but along the coast, it does wonderful because it's not hot there. So I've got a customer on the coast who keeps buying Jonagold all the time. He goes, I want to plant another one of these. They're so good. And both these have better hang time, better shelf life. And then we have Fuji and Red Fuji that ripen late. I put them in October. And they'll hang a long time too. Red Fuji is the consensus taste test winner among all apples. To me, they're a little on the bland side. There are other apples I like better, but in most taste tests, general taste tests, most people like the sweetest apple, and Fuji, if it's properly grown, is really sweet. And Red Fuji, because it's visually more appealing than the original Fuji, usually wins the taste test overall. Although they said if it's a blind taste test, the regular Fuji usually wins because it's got more taste. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is back in the 90s, the Washington Apple, whatever it's called, Commission decided to help consumers find out which Red Delicious apple to buy at the store by their appearance. And they found out that by taste test, the greenest Red Delicious apple had the most flavor. And they decided, we won't sell that point because they look prettier when they're red. People want the red Delicious, but the greenest Red Delicious apples they found had the best flavor. So Fuji, Red Fuji, and then all the rest of the apples seem to ripen at the end of the year. So there's Granny Smith, Pink Lady. Now we're out of Sundowners, but Sundowner is down here. There's Arkansas Black. Oh, one I forgot, Spitzenberg. We brought in Spitzenberg this year. I've grown it in the past. It's quite tasty. It's small, pretty small apple. I believe this was Thomas Jefferson's favorite apple, and they tend to ripen early fall. Pretty small, and it gets worms easy. It's got a lot of faults, but it is got a nice snappy flavor. Some people think it's the best tasting apple. other people say orange pippin is. I've grown that one too. Also small apples, yes.
Oh, the other Thompson Jefferson's favorite was the Newtown pippin.
Which one?
The Newtown pippin. Dave Wilson has it under yellow peanut. But they're the same apple.
Okay.
Pretty good too.
Newton pippin, yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, there's no way this should produce here either, but it does. Arkansas Black. I think that's all the apples we got. We had Ashme's kernel earlier, which ripens a little bit earlier. Actually, it may not. Now, when we get these trees from Dave Wilson, they're up near Fresno, they come with chill on them. So the first year crop on most of these will ripen normal time because they've already got chill. But then when you keep them around Orange County for the next year, they bloom later and they ripen later. So most of these apples we expect them to ripen in December, or maybe slightly earlier, but they all can hang for at least till February, it seems. Now, what's interesting is Granny Smith, Pink Lady, and Sundown are all from Australia. And, of course, Granny Smith Sydney is tropical. Pink Lady and Sundown were developed in Perth, Australia, which is a climate very similar to right here. Although Australia, being on the southern hemisphere, gets more extreme summers and more extreme winters than we do in the northern hemisphere because of the orbit of the Earth, where apparently they're closer to the sun in the summertime than we are. And they're further from the sun in the winter than we are. So we noticed that southern Australia last year, not this year, but last year got snow all along the southern coast, which doesn't happen here that often. I mean, last time it happened, I guess, was 1940. I know my mom told me about it. They live in LA and it snowed. But anyway, these are all real late here. All really good apples. And just so you know, Granny Smith, if you're growing that in Australia, it probably turns yellow. I mean, here, if you leave it on past Christmas, it's a yellow sweet apple. It's no longer green and tart. It's yellow and sweet. I don't think they can do that in Oregon. It would just freeze up there on the trees. But here Granny Smith will turn yellow on the trees, and it becomes super fragrant right around New Year's Day. Because I remember coming home, parking my driveway, and I could smell the Granny Smith from the front yard. I could smell the apples. So that becomes super fragrant. I think the best apple I've grown, this is just my taste, Sundowner. So Sundowner is Pink Lady's sibling. In Australia, these are known as Crips Pink and Crips Red. I don't know why they changed the name when they bring it to the U.S. It makes for a lot of confusion. But Crips Red is the #1 selling dessert apple in Australia. And I think it's really good. It's a little sweeter than Pink Lady and not quite as firm, whereas I think sometimes Pink Lady's getting a little close to Granny Smith in that firmness. Hard to bite. Sundowner is a little more tender, more like, not as tender as Honeycrisp, but more tender than Pink Lady.
Yeah, it seems with the market, because in Europe, the Sundowner goes like Joya, and then Bond relative to Pink Lady, and then it's Crispy Pink.
Right. Yeah, Sundowner, with Alzheimer's, not such a great name for an apple. So, but I think that's the best apple I've eaten now. Unfortunately, we're sold out. At least we got 30 this year. Last year, we got 10, and we couldn't fill anyone's orders, it seems. This year we got 30, but sold out real fast. So that is a good apple. Pink Lady, we still have all these now. We've reordered Ashme's kernel. We hope to have that one by next week. But they're out of Sundowners. I think there are a lot more orchards are going in there, finding out how tasty it is, so they don't have as many to sell. And well, that's red. That's most Sundowner. One of the reasons they said they didn't promote that early on is because it looks just like a red Fuji. Very similar looking apple. Pink Lady real distinct, so they brought that in because they can actually tell it apart. Now, just so you know, there's a lot of apples in stores that are wonderful. Envy, Opal, Sweet, was it Sweet Tart? There's quite a few apples that we're not allowed to sell. So Dave Wilson grows them all because they're the biggest orchard supplier in the U.S. But they're not. They have agreements with the farms that grow the new apples to keep it exclusive as long as they can. So usually it's a minimum of 10 years before they allow something to be sold to the public. So maybe in 10 years we'll get some of those other ones that are out there right now. All right, any questions on the apples? I think we covered everything. Pears, we're still a little mysterious on pears. So pears, commercially there's Asian pears and especially Japanese pears, the one pears developed in Japan, and then there's the European pears. And they're quite different. European pears are called buttery and sweet. Asian people think European pears are slimy. And so Asian people like the Asian pears because they're crisp, tender, but crisp, kind of like crushed ice when I eat them, and juicy, and not so sweet. So a lot of people, like a couple years ago, we had a taste test between a pear that was mostly European and a pear that was totally Japanese. I love the Japanese pear. My employees all liked the one that was mostly European. So, and they were closely related pears on top of that. So now the true European pears have not done well here. My dad grew Bartlett pears for at least 10 years. They'd make fruit every year. The fruit was that big, and that's because pears ripen in the summer. So they were blooming late, didn't have enough time to get any size, and they didn't do well. Asian pears, the true Asian pears may have the same problem. Now, back in the 80s, we had some colder winters. The late 80s, we had probably 500 hours of chill for 4 years in a row, and all my Asian pears did wonderful. And even some of my European pears did really well. I'm going, you can grow anything here. And then the 90s, it got gradually warmer and warmer till about 2015 was when it peaked. The warmest winters, maybe 2015. Now it's going down, backsliding down and getting cooler and cooler again. So we might be able to grow a lot of the Asian and the European pears again that require chill. But what's bothering us is that 2 years ago, we had a really good crop on our Asian pears. It was about 300, maybe 320 hours of chill 2 years ago. But we did have 80 degrees in February and 100 degrees in April. And they woke up in April and bloomed. And wonderful crop of Asian pears. Last year we had much more chill, but no heat. So they didn't wake up. In fact, they never bloomed last year. We didn't get anything on their Asian pears at all, which kind of messed with their minds. So they needed chill. They like the early heat. That's why they grow a lot of Asian pears in the Central Valley and the high deserts, I guess, because they get the chill, but they get that early heat. Now the 80s, when we had the chills, we did have early heat those years. I remember we would get several frosts during the winter, and then it would warm up right away. I remember in February, my whole backyard was blooming at the same time. Everything was blooming at the same time because it was 80 degrees. So that's what seemed to get those pears going in those days was good chill, early heat. Now this year we might get it. We're getting our chill right now. We've picked up almost 100 hours in 1 week, because we're only getting to about 60 in the day right now, and we're in the 40s at night. We're getting some 10 or 12 hours of chill a night right now. So hopefully that continues for another week or so. In fact, they said next storm system's in a week, so we'll see what that does, and see if we can get a good pear crop this year. So it's puzzling to us. Now, there's a couple pears that seem to produce here no matter what. One is Kiefer. So Kiefer and then Hood, which we don't carry anymore. These are both hybrid pears. They're they're mostly European, and but they got a little Asian in them. So they did half and half pears back in the 80s. There's one called Orient pear that was half and half. It produced pretty well for us back in the 80s because we had colder winters, but it didn't have any flavor at all. It was kind of between. We couldn't tell what it was, so we quit carrying that one. So they recrossed the half and half pears with European, and got Kiefer and Hood. In fact, Kiefer and Hood. And so these are 3/4 European, 1/4 Asian. And those both have more typical European quality to them, and they both seem to be fairly reliable here. Hood produced well even on those hot winters. This was developed in Florida. Kiefer, I don't recall where that was developed. So they both seem to produce fruit every year for us. Hood makes these huge, funny-shaped fruits, and I didn't really like them as much, so we don't carry the Hood anymore. We do carry Kiefer, which is more of a pear-shaped fruit. But now we are now carrying 2 half and half pears again that are quite good. Southern King and Tenosui. Now the names of the 2 Asian pears we're carrying right now, just if you want to carry them, Hosui and 20th Century, which is sometimes called Nijiseki. 20th Century is Nijiseki in Japanese. We just call it 20th Century. And Tenosui and both of these are the same parentage. They're both half Hosui and half Tennessee, which is a mostly European pear. And these 2 both seem to make fruit every year for us. We don't know if the fruit's going to get real good size. People keep buying the trees before we get to taste it. But they both seem to set fruit quite well every year. 20th Century Hosui need a little bit of chill, but they apparently don't need that much. And if we have a warm spring, they should have a good crop. Hosui is the best top-rated Asian pear or Japanese pear. And our crop 2 years ago, boy, they were really good. And we had them next to a Tenosui just in case they needed cross-pollination. We had them side by side. They both bloomed at the same time, because this is apparent of that. They both bloomed at the same time, and the fruit ripened pretty much same time in August. So if you live inland about 10 more miles, you're probably really good with the Asian pears and these pears too, because you warm up a little better than we do right along the coast here. But we're keeping both of these around. This is Tenosui. To see what they do this year. If they do well this year, then we'll keep promoting them. If you're out there looking at our stock, we're missing a sign on the Tenosui, but they're out there. Any questions on the pears? Now, pears are highly subject to fire blight. They say all old pear orchards are suffering from fire blight. It's hard to stop it in a pear orchard. So keep an eye on your pear trees. I mean, all the ornamental pears on this street, and there's a lot of them, are suffering from fire blight. So when they get fire blight, the branches look like they've been torched. They just turn charcoal black. The way the disease spreads, if you don't cut off those bad areas, the diseased areas which are actually dead, the fungus is in there, or the bacteria is in there, and when it rains on them, it exudes what looks like honey on the surface of that stem, so the bees come and check it out because it's honey colored. It's not, but they carry it on their bodies to the flowers when they visit flowers. So the bacteria is using bees to do their dirty work from, which is real interesting how that thing evolved. So if you cut out all the diseased woods on your tree and your neighbor's tree, then you shouldn't get as much fire blight. So some areas, especially the newer housing areas of Orange County, you may not ever see fire blight, but if you live in an old neighborhood, you're going to get, you may get, especially this year. We seem to get fire blight worst after following a wet year. Okay, any questions today? Yes.
Any experience growing leaf pear out here?
Yeah, the book says it does fine. I had a tree for 20 years and I had one fruit. I was on it, and one good fruit. I don't know. Now, if you live along any of the low spots in Orange County, you can probably do it. So, all the major rivers in Orange County are a lot colder than the areas in between the rivers because the cold air does flow around the riverbed. So I have a friend who lives on the Santa Ana River. He shows me his Bartlett pears every year. He lives in Anaheim along the Santa Ana River, so inland a little further, but right on, he's one block off the riverbed. So, I wouldn't want to be in this home if there's an arc storm. But normally he's got the best place to grow deciduous crops because he's a little farther inland, so it's a little warmer, but he's right just a block off Santa River, and that's one of the coldest spots in Orange County. So pear trees, especially the European pear and even Japanese pears, would do well along your major riverbeds and in your steep canyons because the cold air does collect there quite well. We're on a little plateau here, so not so good. But there's a lot of flat areas, low areas in Orange County that will collect the cold air really well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.